So Parshas Tetzave, it says, "Ve'ata Tetzave b'nei Yisrael," right? You should command the Jewish people that they should take. It says Shemen Zayach, they should take pure olive oil in order to light the menorah, which is, or to light the for illumination, the lamps. So it says that why does Hashem want us to light the lamps inside of the Mishkan, right, inside of the temple? Like, why is that such a big thing? He starts the Parsha with it. It's the first mitzvah in this section, and it says that Hashem says, "I lit for you along the road, along the path, right? I lit for you. Now it's your turn to light for me." So you say, well, what does that mean? I mean, God lights everything. Everything is from God. We don't do anything. He goes and he made a pillar of fire that used to accompany us in the desert, and it lit up the night so you could see. Right? You know, you go out in the middle of nowhere, it's very, very dark. So he did that. So he said, so now you can pay me back for doing it. So of course we can't pay God back, because whatever light we have is inconsequential to whatever light He makes. But it's a symbol. The idea is that you are trying to show an appreciation for what Hashem does for us. That even though He goes and He makes enormous lights for us, He makes the daytime light, He makes everything light. Right? Hashem does that. Nevertheless, He wants us to show our appreciation by our doing it as well. Some of the commentaries explain that the idea is our being contributory, our contributing to the light. That is, Hashem gives us the light. If we do it or we don't do it, He's still giving us the light. But the fact that a human being can contribute to the work of God is a very important Jewish concept. There's a Gemara that talks, I believe, about Rabbi Akiva having discussions with the Greek philosophers, which was not uncommon, that there's a number of places where they would have discussions. And the discussions always sound sort of not only amicable, but they sounded, for the most part, to be almost like funny. But that's just the way the Gemara writes it. It wasn't like that at all. But so they have a point where the Greek philosophers say to him, they say, what is great? What's better, the work of God or the work of man? That's what they ask Rabbi Akiva. So what do you think he answers? The work of man. Yeah? What do you say? The work of man? Work of God? So he says to them, what as rabbis are prone to do, he said, come back tomorrow and I'll give you the answer. And he comes back the next day, and Rabbi Akiva is holding a cake in one hand and a stalk of wheat in the other hand. And he says to him, which would you like to eat? And he says, well, of course, the cake. And he says, well, the stalk of wheat is the work of God, and the cake is the work of man. So from this you understand that the work of man is greater than the work of God. So well, what's really going on is he's saying that the work of God made the wheat. Without what God does, there's nothing we can do. Right? But God purposely didn't finish the job. He wants us to take the wheat, which is not very attractive to us as something to eat, but it has all the nutrition in it, and He wants us to take it and to manipulate it to be something we want to eat. So we make cake. So God's actions give us the raw product that our intelligence that God gave us can use to build up the object of whatever that object is. In this case, it would be a cake, right? So God wants us to play a role. Why did the Greeks ask this question in the first place? Because the Greeks have a belief that the human body was perfect. That's why, for instance, the Olympics that we all hear about, the original Olympics were in Greece, and they were done without clothing. Right? The athletes would participate without clothing, and this was a big deal for them because they believed that the human body made by God was perfect. It was a perfect something God did and made something that was perfect. So they said the human body is beautiful, is perfect. Why would you go and cut off a piece? Why do you do circumcision? Right? If God makes a perfect human being, what are you doing cutting off a piece of the perfect human being? You're ruining a masterpiece. And they said, no, God made the basic product. God made the human. but then he commands us to finish the job, to bring it to a higher level. Just like he made the wheat, and he commands us to make the cake. And so too here, God makes all the light, and we can't add any light to light, right? Whatever we add is really God's light. But the point is that he wants us to participate in every act within the world to bring the world to completion. And this is a very Jewish concept. Most of the world does not see it this way. Most of the world sees that God does the spiritual world and we do the physical world, and they never meet. Right? The more physical you are, the less spiritual you are. The more spiritual you are, the less physical you are. And therefore, if you want to really be spiritual, you should take a vow to not get married, to not do business, to not be involved in this world, to go sit in the Himalayas and meditate on the world, and that will make you spiritual. And in Judaism, we say that's not the way we do it. Even if that could work, there's a more effective and long-lasting way, which is by involving yourself in the world in a positive way. You take the world God gave us, you take the people that God gave us, and we make their lives better. We improve it. And that's a spiritual thing. Right? We're doing a physical act. I'm giving food to the poor is a physical thing. Right? I go and I make a steak and I give it to a poor person to eat. It's a physical act. I had to buy the steak. Right? I had to cook it. I had to give it to the poor person. He had to eat it. That's very physical. So how is that spiritual? Because my doing something physical for him is actually spiritual for me, because I'm doing it for him. Right? And that's my participating in the purpose of the world that God started. And that's what it's referring to here. Right? That's why it talks right away in the beginning that you should light this menorah, these lights within the Mishkan, even though we don't really need to. God can make it light in the Mishkan. But he chose to ask us to do this so that we participate in the good work that he's done. So that's why it begins with that. Right? And then it goes on and it talks about what different parts of the Mishkan, where different things are. And then suddenly it changes now, because it's going to talk now about some of the eternal aspects of the Mishkan, and then it'll start talking about the clothes of the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol. So he says in the English, "Bring near to yourself Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Yisrael, Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, Elazar, and Itamar." So it says, right, God says to Moshe, take yourself and your brother and his sons. Who are his sons? Right, Nadav and Avihu and Elazar and Itamar are the sons of Aaron. And why? To minister to me, that they should lead. You shall make vestments of sanctity for Aaron your brother, for glory and splendor. He says, now we're going to make the clothing of the priest and the high priest. Right? The Kohanim had special clothes, and the Kohen Gadol had special clothes. Now you will notice that in all of Judaism, while there are things called certain clothes that are a mitzvah to wear, and certain clothes you're not allowed to wear, like you're not allowed to wear what we call shatnez, a mixture of wool and linen. Men are required to wear tzitzis, right? That's clothes, right? Right? You have such a thing, and as I was saying, and nevertheless, the only uniform in all of the Jewish people that is a required clothing is with the Kohanim. You don't have even a mention that there were uniforms in the army. There might have been, but God didn't command the Jews in their army to have a uniform. But the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol has a uniform. And the reason for that is very clear from the name of the word itself, uniform. That is, well, why do they call a uniform a uniform? Is because they want everyone who's wearing it to be the same. Right? You wear a uniform, everyone dresses the same. It makes no difference how much money you have. Right? They always say in some of the Jewish schools, in order to get rid of jealousy and fighting among the kids, we're going to tell all the girls or all the boys that they have to wear a uniform. And everybody dresses the same. It makes no difference if your parents are millionaires or they can't pay the bill. Either way, you're going to dress the same. So as you grow up, everybody treats each other the same. Right? Clothing, right, plays an important role in that. And we see that the only people who have clothing that is prescribed among the Jews are the Kohanim. And the reason it boils down to the idea that the Kohen is supposed to be a representative of God, not an individual person. So that when you go to the Beis HaMikdash, right, to the temple, and you want to give a sacrifice, you don't go and ask for Joe the Kohen or your friend Shmuley the Kohen. Whoever comes, you use, because the Kohen represents God, not himself. So whoever that was. So in order to make it that the Kohanim were looked at as the same, they dressed the same. They looked the same. So when it made no difference who the Kohen was that came to see you, they looked the same. Because it was important is that they're not here as individuals, they're here as representatives of God. Right? That was the idea. So now we're going to make the uniform for the Kohen and for the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. And every aspect of the uniform has very deep meaning behind it as to why they wore a uniform in such a way, especially since they're the only ones that we have that have a prescribed uniform of all of the different types of people in Jewish life. So it tells us, it begins by saying, you shall make these clothes of sanctity for Aaron your brother, and you shall speak to all of the wise-hearted people who I have invested with the spirit of wisdom, and they shall make the vestments of Aaron to sanctify him, to minister to me. These are the vestments, and then it tells you what they are. And then slowly it's going to tell us, after it goes through them all, and we'll go through some of them, it tells us who's going to do it. Who's going to make all these things? Who's going to finish the work in the temple, in the Mishkan? Right? Who is it? Like these Jews, they were slaves. All thing that they knew how to do was to make buildings out of bricks. That's all they knew how to do for hundreds of years. That's what they did. So now they're being told, we want you to make this beautiful building and these beautiful clothes. Well, I don't know how to use a sewing machine. I'm not a clothes designer. I don't know anything about building a building. I'm not an engineer. I'm not an architect. I don't know how to, to draw a straight line to make sure the window's flush. I don't know any of that stuff. Right? How am I supposed to build a Mishkan? Right? So they bring out people whose job it is to do this. The person they brought out, right, was named Bezalel. Bezalel is a name today you hear in Israel, besides it being people's names, but there's a famous school of art in Israel called the Bezalel School of Art. And it's called that because Bezalel, the original Bezalel in this Parsha, used his creativity and his knowledge of the physical world in order to be able to use it to create all the things that the temple and the Kohanim needed. Right? And so when they introduce him to us, they introduce him in a very odd way. And when we get to it, I'll show you. But they introduce you not by his name, only by his name, and not only by his name and his father's name, but by his name, his father and his father's name, right, and his grandfather's name. And it doesn't tell you who his mother is until Rashi comes and tells you that. And so we have to figure that why, and that we'll get to. So he goes on and he says that these are the different, the Almighty says that these are the different parts of the clothing, right, that a Kohen wore. He wore a breastplate, an ephod, a robe, a tunic of a box-like knit, a turban, and a sash. Now, if you look in the pictures here, you see basically what is probably the more accepted opinion for what they had. And then you have the ephod, right, and you've got all different parts of the ephod is like a vest. You see it over here on the corner. And all the different parts of the clothing. And there's made of gold and all types of different things. It says also that he has on the bottom of his robe, if you look there in the robe, he had bells. When he walked, you heard him coming. And that was on purpose. That people should be prepared when the Kohen arrives. They should be prepared. They knew he was coming. They could hear him. From this we actually learn an important law, Jewish law, and it's one of the places where it shows you, is that when you go to someone's house, even if they're close, you should always knock on the door. And even if they say, come in anytime you want, you should knock on the door and then go in. You don't just walk into a house without announcing yourself. Even, in fact, the custom is even in your own home. I mean, not if there's nobody there, but when you, actually, I've seen it many times. You go to your own home, like I would be going with somebody to their home, let's say for lunch. They would get home, they'd knock on the door and let themselves in. So I ask, why are you knocking on the door? It's your house, and you let yourself in anyways. What good is to knock on the door? You're going to make somebody come all the way from upstairs, come down here to open the door, and they're already inside because you didn't wait. He said the purpose is that comes from this idea that the Kohen had bells so that people knew he was coming. They'd be prepared for him. So my family, right, hears me coming, right? They know it's me. They know it's not a stranger. They know it's not a criminal. They know it's their husband or their father who's coming. By the way, I knock and then I go in. I don't just walk in. I also don't want to surprise or frighten people by just walking in. Because we see it all the time. I have it here all the time. I'll come in the back stairs and walk down the stairs and walk out, and there'll be like a few women there, and they'll all jump. And I say, what do you think? You're the only one in the building? Of course they're not. There's like 20 people walking around. But they're just surprised because they didn't expect someone to show up right there. Right? If I had had bells on, they would have heard me coming. That's what it's saying. Yeah, they make for him also, if you look on 469, this is for the Kohen Gadol. It's called the Choshen. The Choshen is that thing around his chest. And it was actually almost like jewelry. It had 12 precious stones in it, each one symbolizing another tribe. And it was a way that the Kohen Gadol could prophesize. That you'd come to him with a question, and he would, if he didn't know the answer offhand, like this, it was a question that you wouldn't know the answer. You know, should I marry this person? Right? How am I supposed to know you should marry that person? What do I know about that person or you that I should answer that question? But God knows. So you could go to the Kohen Gadol and he could consult this, what is called the Choshen Mishpat. It was this thing on his chest with 12 different stones, and he would ask a question and he would get back an answer in the code, and he would have to decipher the code and then tell you the answer. Not everyone had the ability to decipher the code correctly. Sometimes God would take that away from people. And we know in the story of Naomi, by the story of Ruth, we have by the story of Shmuel the prophet, that his mother goes to the temple because she is depressed, because she's been married all these years, she doesn't have a child, and she wants to have a child. And her husband has another wife who has children, and she always makes fun of her. Right? She always says, you can't have children. And so she wants to have a child. So she goes to the temple, right, and she's crying, and then she's in deep prayer. And the high priest comes over, and he thinks she's drunk. That's why she's acting this way. And he wants to get rid of her. But in reality, she's not drunk. She's just very emotional about the fact that she can't have children, and she wants to have a child. So how is it that he thought she was drunk when she wasn't? Is that he consulted this Choshen Mishpat, and it lit up, and it gave him an answer, but it was in code, and he deciphered the code incorrectly. What it should have said is he kashera, she is a kosher person, and what he saw was he shikra, she's drunk, and it was actually the same letters, just not in the same order. So he misunderstood it. So not everybody always gets it right, but the Choshen is always right because it's coming from God.
It also says something like that you can interpret it like Sarah, who has a child like a year after, and she also had a child a year after.
Yeah, it could be a relationship between the two. So it talks about all the different aspects of what it should be made out of and how it should be made and so forth. And then we keep going into more things with the robe. Now, when we get to 472 and 73, here we have now the Kohen Gadol. Up until now, we've been talking about the clothes of the Kohen. The Kohen Gadol were even more things. On 472, you can see the robe with the bells. It was bells alternating with pomegranates. They looked like pomegranates, but they were made out of precious metal. In fact, there is a belief that a archaeologist found he found one of these. I mean, that is a fact. He found a little pomegranate, like man-made, and he's attributing it to the bottom of this coat. We don't know for sure if that's accurate, but it could be accurate, right? It could be that he's right, that that's where it was from. So here's the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, right? If you see in 473.
How come if you're a woman in a Kohen it means nothing, but for a man it's such a special thing?
The tribe, right, goes after the man, while the religion goes after the woman, right? And so therefore, a woman is a Kohen would be the person who works in the temple, right? And only men are working in the temple because they're the only ones obligated to work in the temple. So women can go to the temple, and there's a place for them to pray there, and they can give sacrifices, but no one, like I can't give a sacrifice myself. I can give it to the Kohen. So a woman can do the same. But it's an example that God told Aaron, you and your sons will be priests. So it always went after the men. That's where it comes from. And it's today the only honor they really have is they get called to the Torah first. Right? Because the Kohen has a very special place in our religion, but most of the things he does hasn't been around for a couple thousand years, like working in the temple. Right, okay. Again, it keeps going on talking about the various aspects of that, and then it starts talking about some sacrifices. So rather than going into the details of all the sacrifices, I'd like to address the concept of sacrifices. Because first thing is, even the word itself, the name sacrifice, conveys an incorrect message. The sacrifice is where you take something and you basically waste it for a higher purpose. Right, I'm sacrificing this, I'm giving this up. Right? I've got an animal and I'm sacrificing it for this purpose. Right? That means I'm basically destroying the animal for the purpose of some other purpose. Right? That means I'm sacrificing. In Judaism, sacrifice is very different. In fact, sacrifice is the wrong word. In Hebrew, the word for sacrifice is a korban, but the root word of korban has nothing to do with sacrifice, right? Giving something up. It has to do with, from the word karev, which means to draw close. If I want to, have an intimate conversation with you, I'll get close to you. Right? I'll talk right, like a few inches from your face. Like it's a quiet little conversation just between me and you. That's karev. Korban is a object that helps the offerer, the Jewish person who offers it, to become closer to God. That's why they use the word something that brings you close. That's what a korban is. It's not something that we give up. See, again, it's the same philosophy. In the non-Jewish world, if you want to be spiritual, you have to give up physical. So what's a sacrifice? Sacrifice is I'm giving up physical in order to be spiritual, right? But we don't call it a sacrifice because we don't believe in that idea. We believe that in order to be spiritual, you have to work on the side of dealing with the spirit. It's part of who you are, and it's not extraneous, or it's something that you have to sit all by yourself on the mountain to become holy, to become like that. With us, we'd say you become holy by eating the sacrifice. Non-Jews, according to the Torah, are allowed to offer sacrifices in the Jewish temple, but they can only offer the sacrifice that's totally burnt on the altar, because they have difficulty in understanding how I can bring a cow to the temple, and you slaughter the cow in a very specific way, and you cook the cow and cut it in a very specific way, and then we all sit down and eat. What is spiritual about that? That's not spiritual. I take a cow, you kill the cow, you cook it on the altar, and then I eat it. That's a physical act. So that's how the world sees it. We say no. The way you become spiritual is by using physical. So if you take a piece of meat, you offer it to God in the Beis Hamikdash, right? You take a cow and you do that, and then God says to you, you have to eat a part of it. It's perfectly logical because you're a part of this whole routine. Each person is. It's not independent of us, and the way you become spiritual is by doing these things. It's by eating, right? In fact, since we'll talk about Purim a little bit, one of the famous Dvar Torahs of Purim is that the word Purim is a part of the word connoting the fast day of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur's real name is Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement. Right? Kippur is atone, right? Lechaper. But here we're saying Yom Kippur is a day, right? And we want to return. We want to become closer to God. So what do? We fast, and we pray all day. So it sounds to us, then, what is it telling us? If you want to be spiritual, don't be physical. Don't eat, don't have relations, don't do business, just sit and pray all day. So we do on Yom Kippur. Except that's not the way that God really wants us to do it. He really wants us to do it by doing business and being involved in the outside world in a correct way. Being honest, being kind, working in such a way so that people notice that you're doing this because of the Torah. That's the way we're supposed to be, not in this other way. So that's a very, very important aspect of this, is that it's, again, telling us the same message, that with Jews you become spiritual by being involved in the world. By non-Jews, they, for the most part, believe that you can't become spiritual by eating, right? So when we say that Yom Kippur is a day like Purim, because it's Yom HaKippurim is the real name for Yom Kippur. So what does it mean, Kippurim? So Ke is like, Purim is Purim. Yom Kippur is a day like Purim. Usually if something is like the other thing is the original, and the one that's like it is a copy. So here they're telling you that Yom Kippur is secondary to Purim, because it's like, Yom Kippur is like Purim. And the point is that it's true, that you could go on Yom Kippur and you fast and you go through all the prayers and you really care about what you're doing and you'll be forgiven. It works. But you won't be able to sustain it unless you go out into the world and do things. When you go out in the world and do things, you have to act in a reasonable, ethical manner. If you do that, then that continues you, right? Then Hashem becomes closer and closer to you. That idea, right, is in the Yom Kippur. When we do it on Yom Kippur, it's where we are not acting in a spiritual manner, because we're doing it by abstaining from food. But on a regular time, by our eating, that's how we become holy. I eat kosher, I share it with you, I give some to the poor, I say my blessings, I say the Birkat HaMazon, I do all of the mitzvahs surrounding the meal, so I've now taken that food and raised it up. It's a higher spiritual level than it was before. Or I can be like an animal and just come home and eat whatever I see without any feeling or thought, right? And then it doesn't accomplish the same thing. That's what's coming out of this idea. So then it goes on and discusses some of the different sacrifices and how they're done. So one of the things it tells us is, and I said before that Bezalel is the person whose job was that he had the know-it-all, the know-withal, to be able to know how you did everything in the Mishkan. He knew how to polish stones. He knew how to make fabric. He knew how to build buildings. He knew all of these things. He had the wisdom of God in him. And he was only 13 years old when this happened. And interestingly enough, when Moshe introduces him to the Jewish people, the Torah tells us his name is as I said, Bezalel, and he's the son of Uri, who is the son of what's his name? The son of Miriam. Her husband was Kalev, and it was Hur, right? So his name was Hur. So it says he's the son of Uri, the son of Hur. So usually the Torah doesn't tell us the grandparents of someone's name, right? They call only the person and their parents, not their grandparents. So why does it tell you that? What's so special about Hur that tells us something about Bezalel? That the Torah has to tell us this. So Bezalel, as I said, was 13 years old when this happened, and his job was to take 3 million Jews who had no idea what they were going to do. They didn't know how to polish stones. They didn't know how to weave. They didn't know anything. What did they know? They knew how to build buildings in Egypt. That's what they did. They were slaves for 250 years. And during that time, they didn't know how to work with fine tapestry, gold and silver. They never dealt with those things. Now suddenly God wants them to make the menorah out of this, and they wanted this out of this, and that out of that kind of wood, and that kind of wood. They don't know how to do it. So Bezalel had the ability to know this. He knew how to do it. So he was given that. So why does it tell us who his father and his grandfather are? The father is simple. That's how you identify him. The grandfather is because when Bezalel was given the job to build the Mishkan, he even himself didn't know how he was going to do it. He had the same experiences as everyone else. He had no training as an architect, an engineer, an interior decorator. He had no idea how to do these things. It was given to him as a gift by God. He had the knowledge, but his ability to deal with this and to have that gift and to use that gift had to come from somewhere. So the Torah is telling you that his ability to do what he did comes from Hur, his grandfather. That's why the Torah went out of its way to give you his name. What happened to Hur? So what happened to Hur in the story within the Torah is that in the story we read just last week about we're going to read next week about the golden calf. So it says that when Moshe came down, he saw all the Jews were dancing and singing and praying to this golden calf. Right? So it says that Hur saw the people doing this, right? And he went to stop them. And even though it was him against like millions of people, he still went to do it. And they killed him. Like, he wasn't able to succeed, and they killed him. So the Jewish people actually killed him, right? But so that now that we know what happened, was he right or was he wrong in doing what he did? He went in a very difficult situation, and he was critical publicly of some of the people, right? Is that right or is that wrong? When Hur did that, would we say that he was doing a good thing or not a good thing? So the Torah is telling us, by virtue of the fact that Hur is the example that we use of the person who was the child of Miriam, but in this case of Bezalel, where he didn't know that he knew everything. So it's because that Hur did something very special. Before he died, he saw the Jews worshiping the calf, and he said, I have to stop them. And everyone around him said, you got to be nuts. You got 3 million Jews out there worshiping idols, and you're going to go out there all by yourself, and you're going to change them? Right? So as much as he tried, in the end, he wasn't able to accomplish it. So they added the name, right, that has to do with this idea to his name. Right? And that's who Hur was. Hur's ability to be able to rise to the occasion and to act in an appropriate way was handed down to Bezalel. So if you want to know who did that, it was Bezalel. And even Bezalel's great-grandmother was Miriam. Miriam did the same thing. It says that when Miriam was a girl, her father had made a rule. The Egyptians are so difficult to us, and they're making life so hard that we don't believe that we should bring any more children into the world. Like, why should I have a child? It's just so the child should be a slave. Right? I don't want that for my children, so I don't want to have children. Right? So along comes Miriam, the daughter of the man who says this, and she says, are you crazy? You're divorcing your wife, and you're telling all the men of the country to divorce their wives because you might get hurt, or she might get hurt, and you don't want that to happen? Right? How can you do that? So he understands what she says, and in our case, he atones for what he did there. Right? He went and he didn't act in the correct manner. But the fact that he does it in our case, where he actually goes and it's accomplished by Bezalel, why did he do it? It's because Hur went down from when they were worshiping the golden calf, and he stood up to all the Jews and he said, you can't do that. Moshe is coming. The Torah says you can't worship idols. And then when they killed him, right, so he died, right, for that purpose. Now, was it good or bad what he did? He died for it, so that wasn't necessarily so good. But the Torah seems to think that what he did was good, even though he died, because the fact that he went, right, and he stood up for the right beliefs of how we're supposed to act and how we're supposed to be, that accomplished an enormous amount. And therefore the Torah says, if you want to know where Bezalel gets the ability and knowledge to build this whole place, it comes from his grandfather Hur. That's that ability. That's why Hur is mentioned here. And Miriam also was the same way. It says that when they split the Red Sea, and Moshe and the men were singing as they went through the sea, the women went to Miriam and said, we want to sing too. Right? We have the same feeling the men do. And she says, but women don't sing in front of men, and women don't dance in front of men, so we won't. I don't think we should do it. So the women said, well, we've got everything we need with us, so we can do it and still be modest, right? Still not act out incorrectly, right? So they went and they did, right? And they acted correctly. But we see the same theme going through all of this idea. Okay. And then really it just goes on with some more sacrifices, as I said. So what we basically did is last week's Parsha we talked about the building of the structure itself, the building called the Mishkan. And this week we talk about the inside of it, what's inside, how it's kept, where it's kept, and how you dressed the people who facilitated it, what we call the Kohanim. That's really the basis of what these two Parshas deal with. But let's look at the Haftorah a second on this one, on Parashas Tetzave, and that's on 1159. There's a famous story that I know that you know, but you may never have seen it. It's the story of Samson. God comes to the family, and he sends an angel, and the angel tells the mother, "You're going to have a baby, even though you've been barren, right? And you are going to, and in doing so, right, you're going to end up." Right, he said, let me see. It's on 1157, right? That's that. Maybe I said the wrong page before. Oh no, that's Tetzave. Where's the one for? Talks about Samson. It was just before. So I'll just tell you this from the story of Samson then. The story of Samson, right, is that God wanted him to be a prophet, right? He was a Nazarite who was going to lead the Jewish people. And God sends an angel to come to his parents and tell them that you're going to have a very special child, but he has to be a Nazarite from the time he's born. Because he can't eat certain things, he can't get tameh, he can't drink liquors, wine. There are certain things he can't do because of his position. Right? And the angel appears to his mother. The mother tells the father doesn't believe her. Says, wait, where does this get such an idea? So he says, I want the angel to come back. So he comes back. Right? And he teaches him in the same way that she wanted to have a child, right? And because she wanted it so much, she ended up with this extraordinary child, right? Which was Samson, or Shimshon in Hebrew, which is very similar to Miriam, who, when they, as I was saying before, when they crossed the Red Sea, the men got to dance and sing, the women didn't. So they came to her and said, "We want to dance and sing also." So she went and got a tambourine, and they danced and sang with tambourines, and the tambourines muffled the sound so the men wouldn't be listening to them. So they would be able to stay modest, but yet still celebrate. So you see how she was creative. She used her creative abilities to accomplish a goal. Just like Hur went and decided that he had to stand up to 3 million Jews and say what you're doing is wrong, even though they killed him. He was prepared to give up everything. So we say Bezalel, who was the grandson of these people, right? He had the same traits. He had first the desire to stand up for what's right. He also had used his creativity to build the Mishkan, like his mother did, like his grandmother Miriam did. He used that ability, and that was the knowledge he had. In the case of Shimshon, also they went and they had to be creative in order to. How do you raise a Nazarite? Right? He's a baby. How do you raise a baby to be a Nazarite? No one's ever done it before. But they came up with a way. They used their ingenuity. So these are all examples showing you the idea of Bezalel, why the Torah says Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, and then Rashi says, and the son of Miriam, in order to tell you that he got from Miriam and he got from Hur the ability to be the person he was. That was where it came from. It was spiritual DNA. So then let's take a couple of minutes to talk about Purim, because it's, as you know, it's coming up. So we have the story of the Megillah. First thing is, it says that Haman, he was a pretty bad character. The Torah says that Haman was a malcontent. That means that no matter what he got and what he did, he was unhappy. And how do you see it? You see it right in the quotes and what he says. He goes to Pharaoh, to Achashverosh, and he wants to kill off all the Jews, right? Kill them all. Why? Because he's mad at one Jew, Mordecai. And why is he mad at him? Because he won't bow down to him. And he says, nothing means anything to me because there's a Jew at the gate who won't bow down to me. Nothing means anything. What does that mean? He was the second most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world. Like he was like vice president of the United States, and that meant nothing to him. He was a billionaire for his era. That meant nothing to him. He had a wife. He had 10 sons. Right? He had daughters. That meant nothing to him because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. So here you have a guy who has everything, and one thing in the world doesn't go the way he wants, and everything means nothing to him. And he says that this is all worth nothing because Mordecai won't bow down to me, right? And then the whole story of Purim comes out of that, right? What's the significance of saying the fact that he goes and does that he's a malcontent? The idea is that he was such a person that no matter what happened, he always had a negative thing. He was always something negative that was going on with him. He never saw the positive. And he represents Amalek, right? The dangerous, really criminal that fights against the goodness of the Jews throughout the world. That's who he represented. And Haman's hatred for the Jews was such that he wanted to kill them all. So he goes to the king and he says, I want to kill all the Jews. The king says, not so fast. The Jews pay taxes. If you kill them, no one's going to pay taxes, right? Who's going to pay taxes? So he says to them, I'll give you 10,000 coins. Haman says to the king, he says, this will offset your loss. You're going to get a loss of tax revenue, so you kill off all the Jews. I myself will pay you all the money that they would have given you. So it says that he talks about it. He talks about how he was giving them half shekels. Now, a half shekel, right, it's like half a dollar, but an enormous number of them, right? And the king finally agrees. So the Medrash asks, why does he give him such a funny denomination? Half a shekel. Why don't you give him, instead of 100,000 half shekels, give him 50,000 shekels? Same thing. Like who would go to the bank, want to get $10,000, and you tell them, let's say, what kind of bills you'd like? You say, give me $1 bills. You can walk around with that like you need a suitcase to carry that kind of money. Right? Nobody would do that. So why does he go and give him half dollars, right, half shekels, rather than larger denominations? So the Gemara says that the reason is because it's coming to counteract the Jews giving half a shekel. There's a mitzvah that we have that every adult male is supposed to give half a shekel on behalf of his family to the community, in order so the community could buy sacrifices and do what they needed in the temple. So it was called the donation of a half a shekel. And so Haman was saying that as long as the Jews are half a shekel, the Jews are fighting with each other, they're not a complete unit, I can win. I can beat them. But as soon as they unite and they become one, I can't beat them. Because the united Jewish people are very powerful, but the fighting Jewish people are not. So therefore, he said, they do the mitzvah of half a shekel, so I'm going to give you all of this money, covering all of the half shekels they gave to the temple, to show you that there's no merit for them. And that was really behind this idea. And that's why he gave the money. And that's why we see that. So here we learn a very important lesson about a person being a malcontent and how far he'll go in order to get things the way he wants. He's prepared to kill off all of the Jews of the world because one Jew won't bow down to him. Right? That's really what he was prepared to do. Right? That's one example of something that's found clearly here. Another one is, it tells us, there's a Gemara that says, where is Haman found in the Torah? Because we have a rule that says everything is found in the Torah. That if you look hard enough, you'll find your name in the Torah. You'll find everything in the Torah. So if that's true, where's Haman found in the Torah? So this says, that's easy. It's in the quote in the Parsha of Bereshit that says, Hamin ha'etz. That there was the tree that Adam wasn't supposed to eat from, right? The tree of knowledge. And he went and he ate from it. And now, before he ate from it, the snake offered him and Eve some of this tree to eat, right? And Eve takes it and gives it to her husband, and because of it, we have this whole problem going way back that going right back to the time when the world was created, right? That the people were, they just, how do we put it, right? That even in the days of Adam and Eve. Right, Adam, what did he do? He ate from the tree. God tells him you can do anything you want, but not eat from this tree. So he's not happy. He has to eat from this tree. Just like Haman is not happy. He has everything in the world, but he got one guy who won't bow down to him. Everything means nothing. Adam has everything in the world. Literally, he's the only human being in the world. Right, and then along comes Eve, his wife. That's it. They're the only ones. And God says, you can do anything you want, just don't eat from that tree. What does he do? He wants to eat from the tree. right? The one thing that he's not supposed to do, right? Is just like Haman, right? Same idea. That Haman has everything, but it's worth nothing because this guy doesn't bow down to me. I have everything, but it's worth nothing because I can't eat from that tree. You can eat from a million other trees, but no, can't eat from that one. I'm not happy. Right? There's a similarity between the two. Right? So if you'll one thing you'll notice is that the Gemara asks this question 3 times. It says, where is Haman found in the Torah? Where is Esther found in the Torah? And where is Mordechai found in the Torah? And in all answers are very interesting, because Mordechai, it tells you, it comes from a quote in the Torah that's talking about spices called mordaror. Mordaror is like Mordechai, right? So this spice that was part of the spices that they were like incense, they'd burn in the temple. And then they ask, where is Esther in the Torah? And so coming up in a few weeks, it says, I will hide my face from you. If you don't act correctly, I'll hide my face. Hiding is called a hester. Hester and Esther is really the same. So Esther was like a hidden person, and that's why her name was Esther. So the fact that she, right, so they asked the 3 people in the Purim story, where does they come from? Where do their names come from? And it says for each one something from the Torah, but every one of those 3 things have fragrances. They smell. Right? Esther, it says, is like Hadassah. Right? Esther's name was also Hadassah. Hadassah are Hadassim, right? Which are these, you have them on your lulav. Right? They smell good. Right? It's a plant, and it smells nice. Right? Mordechai is mordaror. It's a spice that was put in the incense. So it smells. And Haman is hamina'et. It came from the tree. Right? Which tree? The Gemara says an esrog tree. Right? That the tree of knowledge was an esrog tree. Esrog has a strong smell. Right? So all 3 of them had strong smells. So there's a famous Hasidic Rabbi who says that this is not a coincidence, that the Gemara asks these questions about these people and answers with fragrances. Because they're not in the Torah. Haman in the Torah is Hamin. Right? It's not Haman. Hamin, it means from this. It doesn't mean Haman. Right? Esther in the Torah doesn't mean Esther. It means hidden. Right? It's a play. They're playing a little bit, but they're teaching us a message. And the message is very profound. If you go back to the creation story, in the creation story you'll notice from the time the snake speaks to Eve to the time Adam eats the fruit, right? First Eve eats it, then he eats it. They really corrupt 4 out of 5 of their senses. How is that? It says that Adam and Eve, they saw the fruit. That's one sense. They heard the snake is the second. Right? Eve spoke to Adam that Adam should eat this fruit, right? That's their talking. And they took the fruit and she gave it to him, right, to eat. So it was her hands. What sense wasn't counted was smell. The sense of smell was not one of the 5 senses used in the destruction of humankind. Because as soon as we ate from this fruit, humankind changed. So the only sense that wasn't affected was the sense of smell. And I think people realize that the sense of smell is an extraordinary sense. It has the ability to be very, very spiritual. First thing is smell. Right? To the naked eye, smell is not there. There's nothing to see. You can smell a fragrance and there's nothing to look at. Right? It's just a fragrance. If a person puts on perfume and she walks by you, you smell the perfume. To the naked eye, there was nothing there. It's just the smell. It's a fragrance. But there's nothing there. There's no physical object. Right? I know if you use an electron microscope there is, but for us there isn't. Right? There's nothing there. A fragrance, you could walk, like I've had this happen where I could be walking in the mall and I'd be doing whatever I'm doing and out of the corner of my eye somebody will walk by me and like a few seconds later I'll smell her perfume and it'll be the same one my mother wore and I will instantly go back to a memory that I don't even remember that I had. Right? Like, or you walk into a store and they'll have a fragrance in that store and something will suddenly come to you that happened to you when you were a kid and you didn't remember for 50 years and suddenly it comes back to you. Or you can that a fragrance can be used in so many ways and it can affect you in so many ways, but there's nothing there. It's not like I'll show you a painting I show you a photograph of your parents. It'll touch you. You'll feel emotional. But it's a photograph. You see the photograph. It's physically there. So all of our senses were corrupted except the sense of smell, which is still the most spiritual of all of our senses. So when it was time for the Jews to be saved against Haman, it was the fragrances that were not abused in the story of the Garden of Eden that saved the Jews. That's why Esther and Mordecai are fragrances, right? And they were able to use this power from before the sin in order to help save the Jewish people. Right? And that's why the Torah asks that question. You don't find anywhere else in the Talmud that they ask, where is Bonita in the Torah? They don't ask that question. Why Haman is better? He's not better, right? Why is Mordecai? Where is Mordecai in the Torah? Mordecai was 600 years after the Torah was given. Like, what are they asking us? So they're sending us this message about the sense of smell, of how significant it is, and how all of the players here are tied into it. They're all tied into some type of a fragrance. And that's why we have the special fragrances we smell in the temple. When you would go to the Beis HaMikdash, they had incense burning. And it was very precise, this incense. It had good smelling things and bad smelling things all mixed up. And you couldn't change it. If you would change it, it says you may as well take your own life. You're not allowed to do it. So God, right? Why? Because fragrances have amazing power, amazing ability to do things. And that's what it was talking about in the Megillah story, about this idea that's there. Now, I'll just close with one more piece, is that in the end, there's 3 places in the Code of Jewish Law, the Shulchan Aruch, that says a rule. It's a very weird rule. The rule says, if you do this, X, backwards, it's like you didn't do it. So, for instance, the 3 things are Hallel, that we say on holidays, the Shema, and the Book of Esther, that we read on Purim. If you read them backwards, you haven't done anything. That doesn't mean you're reading the words backwards or the letters backwards. It doesn't mean you're reading the sentences backwards, because that would be gibberish. It means that you're reading the paragraph, the chapters. Instead of chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're going 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you start at the back of the book, and then you go to the front of the book. And it says in the Book of Esther, it's no good. You didn't read the Book of Esther. If you read it backwards, you didn't do anything. If you say Hallel backwards, you didn't do anything. If you say Shema backwards, you didn't do anything. It doesn't say that anywhere else. Just those 3 places. So if you say Shema and you say it backwards, you haven't done anything. The reason is because when you say the first line of Shema, you are acknowledging that there's a God, right? That's what you're saying. Shema Yisrael, right? Hear, O Jews, there's one God, right? That's Shema Yisrael, right? Hashem Echad, there's one God. We're telling ourselves and others there's one God. Then the next paragraph of the Shema talks about the idea that you have to do mitzvahs, that God expects something from us. And the third paragraph is we actually do a mitzvah. That mitzvah talks about tzitzis, about going out of Egypt. Those are mitzvahs. So we actually fulfill it. If you do it backwards, you're fulfilling a mitzvah for someone you don't even know is there, and you haven't been commanded to do. So you have to do it in order. First you have to know there's a God, then realize that God wants you to do certain things. Because who says God expects anything from us? So he says, I do. And then we do it. If you do it and then say God expects it, and then you say there is a God, it's out of order. It doesn't make sense. Who are you doing this for? You haven't said there's a God. With Hallel, the first half of Hallel talks about the creation of the world, and the going out of Egypt and the getting of the Torah. The second half talks about the Messianic era. And we have a concept that when God does things for us, we have to thank him before we ask for something else. Just like your kids. Your kids come to you and they say, they want something. And we get upset. You're always asking. It's all you do is ask. When in reality, right, if they would come to us and they'd say, thank you very much for the money you gave me yesterday. Could I have $10 today? Right? You won't complain because they're civil. They're smart about it. They thank you first and then they ask. So we also thank God first and then we ask. So if you say Hallel backwards, we're first asking for the Messianic era before we thank him for taking us out of Egypt, creating the world, and giving us the Torah. So you have to say it in order, otherwise you haven't said Hallel. But Megillah, so you read the last chapter that talks about Haman being killed, and then the one before it that talks about Esther and the king and Haman sitting in the room, and him and her disclosing who's trying to kill the Jews and saying that she's Jewish, and then you go back all the way to the beginning, right, backwards. What's the difference between reading that backwards and reading it forwards? The law has to tell you it's no good. And it's because that this is a very important time in history. Up until this point in history, when God did a miracle for us, it was clear and apparent. God split the Red Sea. Anyone who was there will tell you that God split the Red Sea. It wasn't like coincidence the sea was going to split. Anyways, we happened to be there at the right time. Moshe was a mathematician, and he figured out when it was going to split, and he came at that time. Now, nobody says that. Why? Because miracles were obvious. You knew God did this for us. It was right. God killed the firstborn. It wasn't coincidence that they were all going to die that night. They died, right? You had a house, and you had a firstborn in the house, and none of the kids, nothing happens to them, but this guy dies. Right? Clearly, it's coming from God. It's obvious. When we get to the story of Esther, the humankind has slipped in its spiritual level, and it got to the point where God will no longer do an apparent miracle for us, because if He did, we would have no more free will. Because if we would be sitting here in the room, and let's say I get a letter, an open letter, and it says that this letter is from God, and God says that as soon as you finish reading this letter, I'm going to have lunch appear on the table in front of you, and everyone's going to have something to eat. Right? That's right. Then what will happen? You're all going to believe in Him. I mean, I just told you it's going to happen, and boom, it suddenly shows up on the table. You don't see, no one brings it in; it just shows up. Right? A miracle right in front of our eyes. What happens then is you're going to listen to everything God says from then on, but not because you want to, but because you don't want this to happen. Like, you know there's a God. You just saw it. You're going to have to follow His word. Like, it's like if you go into McDonald's with a friend, and your friend and you each buy a hamburger, and your friend bites the hamburger and he dies. Are you going to bite the hamburger? No. Why? Because you don't have free will anymore. You see, I'm supposed to keep kosher. I'm not keeping kosher. I ate that hamburger. I died. So the guy right next to me is not going to do it. Not because he believes in God, not because he wants to do the right thing, because he sees this is real, right? Today, that's never going to happen anymore, because we can't lose our free will. We always have to have the ability to choose to do the wrong thing or the right thing. And if God would make a miracle that was so apparent, we would never be able to do the wrong thing, and therefore there'd be no purpose to life. You have to have that. So from that point in history on, all miracles that God does for us are hidden. You can always rationalize them. You know, I can say that, and I go to bed at night, and I know that tomorrow I have to pay a bill. My mortgage is due $3,000. I don't have any money, right? And then I go and I open the mail, and there's a letter from my aunt who says, you know, I've always wanted to give out money. I made a little bit of money, and I'm sending all my relatives $3,000. Now, she sent it 2 days before. I mean, it doesn't show up in the mail like that. It's not directly from God. It's like it didn't just show up on my bank account. It came from my aunt, right? So that's a hidden miracle. In other words, God caused that to happen right when I needed it, but I could rationalize it and say God has nothing to do with it. It was my aunt, right? That's a hidden miracle. The time when that happens is this time. The story of Esther. Well, up until that point, all miracles were obvious. After that point, no miracles are obvious. There are miracles all the time, but they're not obvious. And that's why, if you read the Megillah backwards, all the miracles of the Megillah become obvious. Because you start with the miracle happening, that the Jews are saved. Then the next chapter, right, the Jews are under threat from Haman. Right, in the next chapter, Haman is brought to a party with Esther and the king. And the next chapter back, right, Mordecai says, we don't know what we're going to do. Haman says he wants to kill the Jews. And Esther says, well, I'm not going to go and start up with him because the king will kill me. Then he goes one chapter back, and Haman has to take Mordecai around the city. And then one chapter back, the Achashverosh remembers that he had to do a favor for Mordecai. And one chapter back, Mordecai saves his life. So if you're reading it backwards, the miracles become obvious.